Within the first hour of the nationwide invasion, within the combat now erupting within the DFW metro area, as the Chinese Trojan shock forces of the PLA's Reserve 59th Group Army, as well as the attached 83rd Air Assault Brigade of the PLA's active duty 83rd Group Army, were rapidly moving to seize and or destroy their given objectives, as it were. Within the DFW metroplex lay many key political, military, and industrial objectives to be seized and or destroyed. This included military installations. It included local political sites and personnel, and also, of course, the total eradication of enemy defense forces, whether military, paramilitary, and even, in some regard, the armed reactionary civilian elements, as seizing key infrastructure was also an enormous priority of the Trojan shock forces, which included the DFW International Airport, the Meacham International Airport, Love Field, and other sites. These would be utilized as mega FOBs, or massive forward operation bases, once the invasion had concluded and the occupation was set to begin, as all of the jumping off points, which were the CCP regime properties which had been strategically purchased for the express purposes of basing Trojan shock units as close as humanly possible to their objectives, would later become combat outposts, as there would still be ample logistical capabilities remaining at these sites, as the supplies that were sitting on these sites were simply monumental. As all of the combat unfolding throughout the entire metroplex with a population of 8 million was simply gargantuan, as the PLA's 59th Reserve Group Army was a relatively large group army, along with the added forces of the attached 83rd Air Assault Brigade from the PLA's active duty 83rd Group Army, gave these forces enormous mobility, as already the 59th PLA Reserve Group Army had massive maneuver elements at its disposal, with the 24th Light Infantry Brigade being among its most rapid ground-based forces, along with its 59th Special Operations Bttn, although it had its own quasi-elite force amongst its total forces, which were the 40th Combat Engineering Brigade. The Combat Engineers were experts in effectively storming heavily fortified areas, effectively mass fortifications under heavy fire, disarming minefields, as well as laying bridges and overcoming other obstacles, as well as even constructing fortifications and obstacles themselves. As the other forces, such as the mechanized infantry troops of the 59th PLA Group Army, such as within their 16th Infantry Division, were also forces that were now engaged in a number of different operations, many of which being flank clearance operations, although there was a key objective, which was the destruction of the 2nd of the 142nd, as well as also the capture of downtown Dallas and the destruction of the 2nd of the 198th being carried out by elements of the 16th Infantry Division. Most of the 16th Infantry Division was effectively now engaged in clearing the flanks and or securing the major key highway infrastructure throughout the metroplex, as these forces were now engaged in Arlington and Grand Prairie, even in Oak Cliff, which was the southernmost suburban-like area of Dallas. These forces were now fully engaged against any and all armed resistance wherever and whenever it appeared. As now, the combat engineers, as it related to their specific operations, were effectively moving in to conduct a variety of objectives in terms of flank clearance as well as also highway security, as it related to the highways in their specific area of operations in the east of the metroplex. Securing I-45 in the Hutchins area was a major objective, although I-45 was not the main invasion route, such as I-35 was, both west and east. I-45 was nonetheless as important in many ways because I-45 ran all the way to Houston and thus was a key route in terms of the occupation that was to follow the invasion, and thus was also important in terms of securing, as 2 battalions from the 40th Combat Engineer Brigade had rushed to clear the flanks and secure I-45 as they would meet resistance from armed civilian militia-type forces. They, with their wide array of capabilities, as again, these were like elite assault infantry, similar to the Russian combat engineers, and these were a highly drone-based and roboticized force, as they depended heavily on armed combat robots that were the quad-legged variety, as well as also the quad-legged demolition-style robots, which could plant and also remove demolition charges and also assist in clearing other obstacles, as these were not armed with the 12.7mm heavy machine gun, but instead had robotic arms to assist in the planting or removal of obstacles and or demolition charges. As these were produced in massive numbers and were relatively cheap, these were a favorite of the Chinese PLA Combat Engineers, as well as certain other branches of the PLA, such as Special Operations, as these heavily armed quad-legged robots boasted a 12.7mm heavy machine gun in terms of the armed robots. These could always plow ahead and clear a path ahead of their combat engineer troops, who would also offer mutual support to the armed robots. As the armed robots would clear a path ahead with heavy machine gun fire, these forces would also provide assistance to clear the flanks of these armed robots to assist them in enabling them to clear the path ahead by ensuring that there were no threats to them on their flanks. As also these combat engineers had within their headquarters platoons in each company, in each combat engineer company, 4 FPV drone operators. These FPV drone operators were also another asset to the combat engineer forces, in addition to their headquarters and support company within each combat engineer battalion boasting their own combat drone section, which operated the TEL-based 48-tube system, which could launch 48 at a time of these very powerful CH-901A loitering munitions into the air. As loitering munitions carried a heavier payload in general than an FPV drone, these were absolutely devastating in their massive numbers on enemy combatants. As the invasion had opened up with massive artillery barrages all over the nation, and including in the DFW Metroplex, a large, enormous 300mm rocket barrage coming in from the PHL-03 battalion, as each one of these PHL-03 systems per each battery could saturate an area the size of a grid square or slightly larger, which was a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer area. One firing battery acting in concert could blanket a much larger area in terms of grid squares. And as a result, there was an area the size of 4 miles east to west by 3 miles north to south that was heavily saturated by PHL-03 systems of the PHL-03 battalion within the 19th Artillery Brigade, firing heavy fire into the southeast of the city of Dallas, which was the Pleasant Grove / Balch Springs area. As heavy rocket fire saturated this area, it was due in part to the ISR capabilities of the PLA spotting massive armed reactionary civilian activity in this area, as many thousands of these armed reactionary civilians had emerged from their homes, and this being a direct result of the loss of the grid, as the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes had nullified the grid and made the city go dark. Many panicked, confused, even angry armed civilians had emerged from their places of residence. And as the ISR capabilities had picked this up, including this orbiting CH-4A armed high-altitude recon drone in this particular sector, the quadcopter assets as well had aided in the strike packages that were pre-prepared and put together by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system in order to eradicate as many of these armed civilians on the flanks as possible, as they were a threat on the flanks of other key operations that were ongoing in this area, including not only just the carpet munitioning of the war industries in the Mesquite area and also in the Dallas area, conducted by one of two H-20 heavy stealth strategic bomber aircraft, but also the destruction of the 2nd of the 142nd, the destruction of the 2nd of the 198th, and the capture of the downtown by a single Air Asslt Battalion coming from the 83rd Air Assault Brigade of the active duty PLA 83rd Group Army, as these two objectives were complementary objectives, though they were different. An armored battalion, one of two from the 16th Infantry Division, had come into the downtown of Dallas to assault and destroy the 2nd of the 198th where they stood, while the air assault forces, although they were focused on capturing downtown to convert it into a red zone that was intact and not destroyed, they were to capture it as much intact as possible, aided in the destruction of the 2nd of the 198th, just as the armored battalion aided in the capture of downtown, as they were complementary objectives. The destruction of the 2nd of the 198th and the capture of downtown intact were complementary objectives, although the armored battalion's main objective was to destroy the 2nd of the 198th, and the air assault battalion's objective was to capture downtown intact. They both ended up working together to not just capture downtown intact, but to also destroy the 2nd of the 198th, as the flanks had to be cleared in all sectors of the fighting in the southeast of the city, as it was along a major highway within the metroplex, I-635, which was in the occupation phase after the invasion had concluded to be used as a key logistical and troop movement route, needed to be secured by the combat engineers within this area of operations, as other combat engineer battalions moved in to capture other highway segments and or destroy enemies on the flanks. This particular battalion of combat engineers, after having assisted this battalion to their south in surrounding and destroying 200 armed reactionary civilians within the first hour as the barrage was occurring, now diverted its forces to arrive by 1:30 a.m. and surround an area that ended up being a 2-mile by 1-mile area out of the original 3-mile by 4-mile area, which is pictured as many of the armed reactionary civilians had been outright annihilated. 800 of them had escaped into the drainage and sewer systems, as well as also in a few of the more sturdy buildings hiding in the basement or first floor levels, as the 300mm rockets completely annihilated everything around them, leaving very little left, if anything, other than empty facades and pancaked buildings with roofs caving in or collapsing facades, as mentioned, and very little left, including the support beams, which were the remains of what building integrity would have had insofar as these industrial sites, as many of these industrial sites had very little left remaining in terms of roofs and facades, as many of them had been completely eradicated. The very fortunate and blessed armed reactionary civilians that hid in the proper places in some of these factories, such as in the metal fabrication plant, if we go to the map, this plant being in the Balch Springs area across this tributary that ran through the area, separating Balch Springs from Pleasant Grove, which was the southeast of Dallas. This was mostly a mixed residential and quasi-industrial area, as there was a DART light rail line here in the mauve color coding that ran through the area, this being a train station in the Pleasant Grove area for the light rail system, So the bridge went over the freight rail system, which ran through this area as well, as again, this was a quasi-industrial area, this being a glass factory, and there were other smaller factory sites along the freight rail line. The metal fabrication plant had a relatively sturdy main building in the south where much of the metal fabrication activities had occurred. There was also a secondary building in the north of the plant, as it had a road. This relied on effectively on trucks to transport their materials through their supply line for this industry, and thus they would come in through this main entryway right here, this being the office. In total, there had been 200 armed reactionary civilians spotted by the ISR assets fleeing into this building. As quadcopter assets got closer, they could fly through the destroyed facade and see all the movement inside and return to allow their troops to map the area in real time, running circuits in order to see where each and every individual enemy personnel had been positioned as much as possible, as these buildings were heavily ruined and rubbled. There were occasional difficulties at times as seeing exactly where some enemy personnel were, as some of them had managed to meander through the rubble in such a way to where they almost became a part of it. However, the combat in this area, though it would last several hours, would be extremely thorough and would involve the mass use of C4 disposable demolition DJI track-based robots, which had massive dexterity and were extremely reliable and maneuverable through the rubble, as if they flipped over, they could continue rolling, as they had tracks on both sides. They were virtually unstoppable in terms of their ability to maneuver into an area and demolish it in terms of enemy strongpoints or obstacles and more, as these were highly reliable and enormously mass-produced, even more so than the already gargantuanly stockpiled quad-legged robots produced by the Chinese. They also had bipedal robots, which were two-legged, but it had been decided that the quad-legged robots had the most dexterity required for the combat engineers in order to operate in urban and also rural environments, as the additional two legs, as opposed to a bipedal robot, offered this robot more maneuverability in certain situations, and thus the combat engineers had effectively gone with the quad-legged robots, as well as also utilizing massive amounts of the disposable track-based DJI disposable demolition robots, as these each carried 4 pounds of C4 explosives and could cause massive destruction to enemy positions as well as enemy fortifications and more, as they could also, again, utilize their unarmed quad-legged robots to plant demolition charges. It was often decided in lieu of that it was better to use the disposable robots as opposed to risking their slightly more expensive quad-legged robots for this task. Again, they preferred not to lose their quad-legged robots if they didn't have to, as again, these were exceedingly widely available and disposable and could be replaced almost as fast as they were utilized. And not only did they have a highly roboticized force in terms of the PLA Combat Engineers, but again, they utilized FPV drones at their platoon, at their headquarters platoon level, at the company level, and they also at their battalion level had the section of combat drone forces that operated the TEL-based CH-901A loitering munition systems, which could be equipped with a fragmentation warhead, a heat warhead, which is high explosive anti-tank, or just a regular HE or high explosive warhead. And as all of these systems will work together in tandem and all be coordinated through the ISR capabilities of the PLA, which were gargantuan and immense, as well as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, who utilized the ISR capabilities as its eyes and ears, could put together the pre-prepared strike packages and even guide these forces on where and when to maneuver, what weapons to use, and how. And all of this capability was highly advanced in terms of the PLA's IT, AI, and ISR capabilities all blended together, allowing for these forces to maximize and economize their firepower to devastating effect, and also highly coordinate their movements and actions with one another as it pertained to the different companies and their different platoons all working together, even down to the squad level, as all of this again was highly coordinated. The combat engineers also had an array of very capable vehicles. Not only did they have their standard armor personnel carrier, which was similar to the infantry and armored infantry forces, being the Type 89A, but they had their very capable armored engineering vehicle, which was known as the GCZ-115. They also had another armored engineering vehicle, which is specifically a mine clearance vehicle, which could fire plastic explosive line charges and also had a plow similar to this GCZ-115. It was the GSL 130, as in this, the PLAN, or People's Liberation Army Navy Marines, are using a GSL 130 to fire a line charge to destroy enemy fortifications, as it was not only effective against clearing minefields, clearing paths through those, but it was also highly effective at destroying fortifications, and even enemy personnel that were in the way as well suffered drastically, as they would be outright annihilated by such weapons. As the PLA, the ground forces, or the army, would of course have such a vehicle painted in their colors. They had two platoons with the GCZ 115s and one platoon with the GSL 130 in each PLA Combat Engineer company. As again, they had three combat platoons, two with these vehicles, GCZ 115s, and they had one with the GSL 130. As again, these were very powerful vehicles, and the GCZ 115 in particular had an arm which it could maneuver to dig up any obstructions in its path, as well as also earth, and also even could be used to create fortifications, as the combat engineers were a highly versatile force. In this particular animation or illustration, if you will, of the combat, each platoon with its very powerful ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicle, along with their armed combat robots, each company having 5, are laying down heavy firepower into these rubbled ruins, where there are enemy personnel having had been sighted by the quadcopter assets running their circuits. 2 enemy personnel have been wiped out trying to flee, and they're laying down heavy fire, including this armor personnel carrier, in order to allow for the engineering vehicle to conduct its work, to plow through the rubble, obstructions, and abandoned vehicles and clear a path in order for the rest of the engineering forces to continue en route to their objective. In this particular instance, the combat engineers were conducting an envelopment around the area, as it had been highly saturated by 300 millimeter rocket fire. There would be air support as well, as a JH-7 Flying Leopard would drop 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions on the southern building of the metal fabrication site. As in this particular illustration or animation of the combat, these combat engineers are taking each rubble pile bit by bit as they advance, as they also have their vehicle-based fire support, as this particular Type 89A with a local added implement to it, a local sort of upgrade, if you will, having slat armor placed on the side of this Type 89A to protect it from certain types of anti-armor weapons, such as AT-4s. This heavy machine gunner in his turret of this APC is firing at enemy personnel and the remains of this gutted building, while the ZBD-04A in this platoon is continuing forward to aid the troops who are laying down fire. Could being able to provide tactical L-vectored fire into this particular strong point as these other troops advance from a different squad, being guided by their quad-legged, heavily armed 12.7 millimeter machine gun equipped mobile fire support platform. As you can see, a Type 69 has been fired from a squad member in this squad at this building to assist these forces in their vectoring of fire. This JH-7 has buzzed the battlefield after dropping heavy munitions off in the distance. There's also the loitering munitions, quadcopter assets reconning the area, and a WS-35R rocket-assisted, satellite-guided 155mm shell coming in to hit this area. Within the battle that would occur in this part of the city, which in this particular 2-mile by 1-mile map was a segment of this larger 3 by 4 mile area, as the area condensed as this Combat Engineer Battalion surrounded it while the bombardment was occurring from the very powerful 300 millimeter PHLO3 battalion, as one firing battery had continuously laid down fire into this area, completely eradicating most areas while preserving the highway infrastructure of I-635. This was because, again, this would be highly useful to the occupation forces post-conclusion of the invasion phase, as 5 of 7 combat companies, not including, of course, the headquarters and support company, would cordon this entire area, with one company cordoning the area from the east, one company cordoning the area from the west here in Pleasant Grove, as this was in Balch Springs, across from the highway I-635. There were 2 companies cordoning from the north, and one moving this way, stopping at the tributary at this embankment. And there was a spread out company in the south, making 5 total companies. As these companies surrounded the area, they would push through all of the rubble gradually, as it would take them several hours to gain full control of the area, as armed reactionary civilians, numbering 800 out of the original 2,500 that were seen by the ISR assets and destroyed by the rocket barrage, had hidden underground in the drainage and sewage systems. These were manhole covers. Some would even be coming up out of the manhole covers a bit late to fight the combat engineers, while some others had been blessed and hid in the lower levels of this metal fabrication plant and had survived the bombardment. Some moved into the former office, which was in complete and total abject ruination. There would be 12 personnel in here. They would be assaulted by forces from 2 companies, as the vehicle-based firepower from the company cordoning the north would be levied into these buildings, and also 2 platoons having been deployed into these 2 city blocks. This platoon deploying its squads into this city block, while this platoon, the second platoon of the 3 combat platoons, not counting the headquarters platoon off map, deployed a platoon to this city block, and the vehicles would lay down fire into these buildings, although they would take return fire as indicated by all the green. Nothing would effectively impact these vehicles in such a way to where they would suffer any damage, as they were only taking small arms fire, which did effectively nothing to them. As these armed combat robots, these 5 came from this company in the north, Cordon, they would assist the East Cordon Company's platoons in securing this facility. As this was all going on at the same time as this company had deployed all 3 of its combat platoon squads, leaving only its gunner and driver and high-ranking NCOs and officers in these vehicles. One platoon took position in this destroyed building as rockets had hit this area and destroyed everything while preserving the highway infrastructure, as again the real-time AI battlefield data processing system was a highly precise system and protected the highway while economizing firepower into other areas, as they deployed 1 platoon here, another platoon here, and their 3rd platoon here in the north. These forces would work together to secure the metal fabrication plant and eradicate all the armed reactionary civilians contained within, working together with the forces of the Northern Cordon as well as there being another Northern Cordon Company moving down this street, they would only deploy one platoon of their 3 combat platoons, plus their 5 combat robots into this area, as they would secure the crossing and have a field of fire that effectively controlled this area, while this combat company that was effectively on the western end would immediately have these forces destroyed by strikes from fragmentation warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munitions, would destroy these forces with heavy machine gun fire vectored into this area, into this rubble of these former homes in Pleasant Grove. The last movement would be an incoming mechanized infantry company from the battalion of mechanized infantry securing Oak Cliff, as they were doing their own flank clearance operation in the south central portion and southwest portion of the city of Dallas. And they would eventually send one company in to assist the combat engineers, although, again, by the time they arrive, they would not be needed, as the combat engineers will have by then secured the entire area. As again, the combat engineers were like elite assault infantry. They were used to effectively training to storm heavily fortified areas and heavily mined areas. They could cross tributaries with their PB-79A pontoon bridges. They had trained and were very versatile in terms of assaulting some of the most heavily fortified locations, and also rubbled locations such as destroyed city areas and urban zones. And thus, they were the perfect force to ferret out all of these armed reactionary civilians that had survived the heavy bombardment from the 300mm rocket strikes at the opening of the invasion, as again the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had deemed that all of these forces were a major threat to the flanks of the key objectives of seizing the city of downtown Dallas intact, as well as destroying the 2nd of the 198th and the 2nd of the 142nd. They did not want these forces harassing the supply lines of the units participating in these actions, and thus they needed to be destroyed at all costs. That is why, within the scope of 4th generation warfare, the invasion forces had planned everything to the letter. CCP regime properties were purchased as close as possible to their objectives, and if at all possible, dangerously adjacent to their objectives, which was the preferred outcome in terms of purchasing properties. Although this was not always possible, they purchased properties as close to their objectives as possible. And in the instance of the units that were dedicated to clearing flanks and securing the key routes, including I-45, which ran all the way to Houston, as well as the major invasion route of I-35, both E and W in this instance, as they come together again in Gainesville and to the south in Hillsboro. These seizures of these invasion routes was of the utmost importance for logistics and troop movement, as well as also, again, securing the major invasion routes for the external invasion components to move seamlessly through this major node, as the big cities and medium cities along the highways were considered key nodes that had to be secured. Securing the flanks was of the utmost importance, just as much as capturing the major objectives, such as the red zones of downtown Dallas, downtown Fort Worth, destroying the military installations such as the Naval Air Station, also the Taylor Army Heliport, securing the major airport infrastructure such as the DFW International, Meacham International, Love Field, and others such as smaller airports. All of this was of the utmost importance, as well as also taking major infrastructure objectives in terms of power plants and also water and sewage treatment facilities, which again, the American forces in this area did not have the force numbers available to secure everything, so they had to decide what was most important, and they opted, instead of like in Oklahoma City, where they had effectively deployed force to secure the infrastructure in the area, these forces had instead been diverted to defend military-industrial sites, such as the Raytheon facility in Richardson, as well as also the 1st of the 204th SHORAD Battalion defending the industrial site immediately to the south of the Naval Air Station, which again would be heavily carpet munitioned by an H-6K heavy strategic bomber, along with the unit of the 1st of the 204th, most of it, with the rest of it being destroyed on the Naval Air Station. As all of this, as Lockheed Martin, south of the Naval Air Station, the facility, the Raytheon facility in Richardson, also the shell manufacturing plant in Mesquite, the second of two, as America only had two, one in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and the other now in Mesquite, would be heavily carpet munitioned by H-20 heavy stealth strategic bomber aircraft, along with all the aircraft manufacturing facilities adjacent to the airport in Irving and other areas. These would all be hit by heavy strategic bombing, also artillery strikes, and more missile strikes as well. As the flanks still had to be cleared, the combat engineers were the perfect force for moving into such a heavily rubbled area after being annihilated and completely ruined by rocket strikes. These forces could plow their way through all the rubbled ruination that was now this part of the city and clear paths in order to ferret out the enemy forces continuing to resist in the area. As the rocket strikes created massive carnage and abject annihilation, the combat engineers would indeed clear a way through and begin to ferret out all of the resistors that could pose a threat to the flanks. And again, they would have potent air support in the form of a JH-7 strike aircraft dropping 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions onto what was even left of the metal fabrication factory, which would destroy over 100 lives as these munitions would impact and completely bring to the ground what little bit was even still standing of the factory, as this would be a powerful strike, as the JH-7 was an enormously powerful strike aircraft, as the rocket strikes had already done such immense damage to this part of the city. There was almost nothing left, as it were. The 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions would surely bring whatever little bit was left to the ground in a massive cloud of dust and debris. As the forces were in this position, as the platoons had all been deployed from the combat platoons, one in the south, one in the center, and one in the north, as the one in the center and one in the north would go to clear the metal fabrication plant, and the one in the south would effectively hold their position along the tributary to cut off any escape by the American armed reactionary civilian forces hiding out in former residential neighborhoods that were all brought completely to the ground, complete rubble ruination. As again, there was a company just off the map cordoning the south. They were off map and can't be seen in this particular map. However, they were there in position, while the company cordoning the west would deploy their 3 combat platoons to sweep their area of operations as well. As all of this heavy combat would be underway, even the other northern cordon company would deploy 1 platoon of its 3 combat platoons to clear their sector and control crossings in the area. As the platoons deployed in the west would be fighting through quasi-industrial areas such as this former glass factory that was heavily destroyed with very little bit of its ceilings standing, as there were 45 personnel taking cover within it, as well as another 50 in the other building. These areas would be hit by C4 demolition robots, as again, these would be utilized heavily to bring down what little bit remained of these buildings, as they would find areas where remaining structural integrity was still being kept up in terms of the girders and beams, and destroy them and make the rest of the building collapse onto the forces within, or just simply roll them into a group and blast them to pieces. As also they had heavy support from their drone-based capabilities in terms of their kamikaze loitering munition drones and kamikaze FPV drones. They also had their dedicated combat drones, which were flying missile-carrying vehicles, which could fire their potent ATGMs, including their dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-tank ATGMs, their CM502KGs, or their HJ-10s, which were a relatively long-range and potent ATGM as well, at targets on the ground. There would be 5 of these dedicated Wing-Loom 2 combat drones operating within this particular battle space, as they would offer enormous and precise support to the forces on the ground, as they also had their very powerful vehicle-based firepower. As at the very opening of this map, as it opens up, 3 fragmentation-equipped loitering munitions, CH-901As, had destroyed these forces in conjunction with heavy machine gun fire from this armored personnel carrier from the lead platoon. As this Type 89A was firing into these forces, they were also hit and destroyed by these loitering munition strikes. As again, the last move on this map would be an incoming mechanized infantry company from the Mechanized Infantry Battalion from the 16th ID, clearing Oak Cliff area, sending one in case of need of reinforcement. Again, they would not be needed. The combat engineers would have this area completely locked down and cleared by the time they would arrive. The fighting would be heavy and would last several hours as the combat initiated technically by 1 a.m. with the surrounding of the area. By 1:30, the forces had plowed into the area, shrinking the envelopment into a 2-mile by 1-mile area after having plowed through many obstructions and abandoned and destroyed vehicles and rubble from destroyed buildings. They had made their way in company by company to envelop and surround this area as their forces moved in. And again, had very powerful capabilities. Again, they were a highly drone and roboticized force. They also had very powerful capabilities in their vehicles. So again, they're very potent CBD-04A infantry fighting vehicles are already a force to be reckoned with, but they had their armored engineering vehicles, both the GCZ-115s and the mine clearance GSL-130s, which fired the plastic explosive line clearance charges and could wreak havoc on enemy forces. And of course, they had, again, their standard armor personnel carrier, their Type 89As with their heavy 12.7 millimeter machine guns. And again, all these forces were absolutely crack elite fighting forces, and they were devastating against their opponents. In this particular animation or illustration, light machine gun fire from the QBJ-201. The riflemen of the combat engineers are laying down fire. One is throwing a hand grenade into this area as their quadcopter assets had already spotted an armed reactionary civilian meandering through rubble running into this area. His rifle is now exposed. They can see him. They're throwing a hand grenade to destroy him, to allow their armed robots moving ahead of them, clearing a path ahead of them, to continue to rain down heavy fire on these ruins. As again, somebody's cranium and torso had literally exploded into a cloud of mist, of blood, and this as a result of continuous fire from 12.7 millimeter fire into this structure, shredding through it eventually and hitting those on the other side, as this was technically an anti-materiel weapon, as it was very powerful. This same case can be said here, as this is laying down heavy machine gun fire on another area, as this personnel has been hit in the head by a combat engineer firing up into this personnel's head. Return fire is being meted out against these robots, but it is to no avail. As this personnel was trying to flank the robot, he would be hit by a grenade, as these forces effectively offered mutual fire support to one another. They cleared the path ahead in terms of the robots, and these forces guarded their flanks as they moved in behind them. And they could maneuver their highly mobile and very dangerous 4-pound C4 equipped DJI track-based demolition robot into any area to demolish it. There were hundreds of these available just to this battalion alone. And again, they were easy to replace. When they had their logistical resupply operations, they would get more as needed. As these forces were now moving into the area, laying down enormous volumes of fire, as they now were moving rubble pile to rubble pile, gutted building facade to gutted building facade. Their forces were highly capable, exceedingly well-trained, very, very heavily armed, and ready for action. As, again, the forces would be supported of the combat engineers by an airstrike, a very powerful one, 4,000 pounds of munitions, even a satellite-guided WS-35R, rocket-assisted satellite-guided shell, would hit enemy positions, as some of the last armed reactionary civilians, as they would be pushed from place to place, would be congregated into one area where this type of artillery strike could occur with a high degree of success and accuracy, as they would be seen and annihilated, as anything that can be seen on the modern battlefield can be absolutely destroyed on the modern battlefield. thus the high capabilities of the PLA's ISR assets and how the AI capabilities linked to that are able to put together such devastating strike packages that economize and maximize the destructive potential and capability of all these weapons against their given targets. As again, most cannot fathom or understand what this concept even entails, but what this means is that all of these systems have become exceedingly more accurate and thus more deadly and dangerous than has ever before been possible, because the AI can put together absolutely precise strike packages that completely eradicate all in their path. As the westernmost cordon company in the envelopment had dismounted their 3 combat platoons, leaving their headquarters platoon behind and just off map safely, which was their command and logistics of just their company. They were now moving through the quasi-industrial areas along the freight rail lines, which go underneath this bridge of the Dart local train line, which is a passenger line here in the mauve color coding, and there's a train station here that would be fought over, as these forces would take many minutes exchanging fire and moving in demolition robots to eradicate enemy personnel, as well as also utilizing their loitering munition assets, as well as also their FPV drone assets to destroy enemy personnel, as well as also their armed combat robots and vehicle firepower. All of this combined was absolutely devastating, along with the dedicated combat drones such as the Wingloon 2s, which were produced in enormous numbers and thus were utilized to the fullest extent. Although China had way better and more advanced drones than the Wingloon 2, the Wingloon 2 was exceedingly cheap and very easy to mass produce, and thus there were enormous quantities of them, and thus they were being used in such massive amounts, as they could carry 12 ATGMs, or other air-to-ground munitions. These were excellent weapons for the task at hand, and 5 of these dedicated combat drones with 48 CH-901A loitering munitions equipped with their fragmentation warheads, along with dozens of FPV drones being utilized by the different companies' headquarters platoon FPV drone operators, as each headquarters platoon had 4 FPV drone operators. They would effectively wreak havoc on enemy personnel, as of course the combat engineers themselves, not only did they have their track-based disposable demolition robots made by DJI with their 4 pounds of C4 apiece, but they also had their ATGMs in the form of the HJ-08s, they had their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, they had 35mm tube-fired grenades from beneath some of the rifles of the troops in each squad that carried them, and more. These forces were exceedingly well tailored for the fight that lay ahead, and they would advance through the quasi-industrial areas and eventually push their way into the residential area across the tributary that lay across from the Balch Springs area. As again, this was where effectively Balch Springs meets up with the Pleasant Grove area, which is effectively southeast Dallas. The combat robots, again, would support the movements immensely. The combination of these heavily armed robots, the loitering munitions and FPV drones, as well as also the dedicated combat drones, would ensure a relatively easy victory, although it would take time. The victors would lose very few troops with all of this support, as well as the AI and ISR dominance and IT dominance, effectively information technology. These forces had an enormous technological advantage over the forces they were up against, which were the armed reactionary civilians, who lacked any coherent command structure at this moment in time. They lacked any coherent logistical structure, meaning that they could not sustain defensive operations, as they had no means by which to supply themselves over time. As again, they were reactionary, they were reacting to the invaders, they had no plan, they had no actionable intel, they were just picking up weapons and fighting without any type of organization or logistical backing. This was effectively a kamikaze mission on their part because, whether they knew it or not, they did not have the wherewithal or capabilities to go up against a force as mighty as the PLA, as China was the most powerful nation that ever existed in all of human history. They were the only true superpower that existed in the world at this time, as they had been the only sole superpower by real facts, figures, stats, capabilities, national assets, and attributes since at least 2016. Russia, also a Tier 1 power, although not China-sized, was right behind China, and America stood no chance against either one, as Russia alone had bled the entire collective West dry of munitions and even some platforms in the Great Eastern European proxy conflict, and now the chickens were coming home to roost, as the saying went, as this effectively was the introductory video to the operation being conducted by the combat engineers, clearing the flanks and securing within their area of operations their segment of I-635. More will be covered in the next video installation of this hypothetical documentary series highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines, as again, these doctrines are effectively the newest and most modern of all war doctrines, blending asymmetrical and regular symmetrical warfare capabilities with high technology, effectively blending the Trojan shock army component with the external component, which takes a backseat to the Trojans in this doctrine, as they are merely the heavy-handed reinforcement of the Trojan shock forces, who are doing the heavy lifting, as the Trojans are doing most of the work in this doctrine. They are to race as fast and deep inland as possible, unobstructed, as in not having to stop for anything other than logistics, as in not having to stop to engage enemy forces, as all the key nodes all up and down the invasion route are to be secure by the Trojans, and therefore preventing the externals from being slowed down. If the Trojans have the nodes all up and down the key invasion route secure, the Trojans the externals can continue unobstructed, not having to stop for anything but logistical resupply, as in refreshing some ammunition that may have been expended en route, or maybe having to stop for fuel or maintenance, food, water, and other needs, as again, the race would be on for the externals to get deep inland as fast as humanly possible, unimpeded, while the Trojans were to do the heavy lifting, securing the key nodes, which were the major cities and objectives all up and down the major invasion routes and in other areas, as again, major military installations and major military units and enemy forces had to be completely eradicated as fast as possible, as again, the armed reactionary civilians were also a priority, but nowhere near as high of a priority as were the actual enemy military forces, which were the key objectives, along with military installations, key infrastructure, and more. As, again, more to come in the next video installation of this documentary series highlighting fourth-gen doctrines.